They crossed thousands of kilometers of hostile territory, crushed two major European armies in back-to-back days, and reached the gates of Central Europe in a single campaign season. And almost nobody ever asks the one question that should make everything else impossible. How did they eat? If you're watching this on a TV or big screen, welcome. This is exactly the kind of video that deserves a big picture. If you haven't subscribed yet, it genuinely helps this channel reach more people. And sharing this with someone who loves history is even better. Now let's go back to 1241. When people imagine the Mongol invasion of Europe, they picture an unstoppable wave of horsemen riding out of the east. Fearless, brutal, and seemingly unstoppable. They picture the destruction of Krakow in Poland. They picture the Battle of Legnica on April 9th, 1241, where Duke Henry II the Pious of Silesia raised an army of somewhere between 25,000 and 30,000 soldiers, including Knights Templar, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights, and watched that army get obliterated in a single afternoon. They picture the Battle of Mohi, fought the very next day on the banks of the Sajo River in Hungary, where Batu Khan and the legendary General Subutai annihilated King Belethart's forces in one of the most tactically sophisticated engagements of the medieval world. Two battles, two kingdoms shattered, 24 hours apart. The Mongols were operating across 500 kilometers of terrain, with multiple armies that couldn't even communicate by anything faster than a horseback messenger. And yet, they coordinated these strikes with a precision that no European force of the era came close to matching. But here is what almost nobody ever asks. What did those men eat on April 9th? What did they eat on April 10th? What were they eating for the 3 months before that, as they crossed the Carpathian Mountains in winter? And what were their horses eating? Because without the horses, every single thing the Mongols were about to do was physically impossible. The answer is not a story about barbarian survival. It is the story of a logistical system so alien to European thinking that even today, most historians underestimate how deliberately it was engineered. Start here. An army needs calories. This is the most basic fact of military history, and also the most ignored. A soldier doing hard physical work in cold weather, riding, fighting, setting up camp, standing guard, burns somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 calories per day. A Roman legion, a Byzantine army, a crusader force. They all solved this problem more or less the same way. They built a supply chain, wagons, roads, warehouses, organized resupply depots, administrative systems to move grain from one place to another. This worked, but it created a ceiling. Your army could only move as fast as your supply wagons, and your supply wagons could only go as fast as oxen, roughly 3 kilometers per hour, working perhaps 5 hours a day. The army was chained to its own logistics. The Mongols had no wagons, they had no supply depots, they had no warehouses, they had no roads, and they conquered more territory in 25 years than Rome conquered in 4 centuries. The reason they could do this begins with a number. 5. Each Mongol warrior rode with approximately 5 horses. Some accounts suggest as few as 3, and as many as 12, depending on the mission and the region. But most historians have settled on 5 as the operational baseline for a campaign like the 1241 European invasion. 5 horses per warrior. This is not excess. This is the system. A warrior never rode the same horse into exhaustion. He rotated through his animals across the day, keeping each one relatively fresh. This meant he could cover distances that would have destroyed a European cavalry force within days. Contemporary sources, including the account of the Franciscan friar William of Rubruck, who traveled through Mongol territory in 1253, describe Mongol riders covering 100 kilometers per day under the right conditions. European armies of the same period considered 30 kilometers a good day's march. Now do the arithmetic. If Batu Khan's campaign force entering Central Europe in 1241 numbered somewhere around 40,000 warriors, and historians' estimates range from 40,000 to 150,000 total personnel including auxiliary forces, though the core cavalry was likely in the range of 40 to 80,000. Then 5 horses per warrior means 200,000 to 400,000 horses moving across the Hungarian plain at the same time. This is not a military force. This is a migration. And migrations need to eat. Here is where the system reveals itself, because the Mongols had solved the horse feeding problem in a way that was so elegant it almost looks accidental. Horses don't eat grain. Horses eat grass. And the Eurasian steppe, the vast corridor of open grassland stretching from Mongolia all the way west through Kazakhstan, across Ukraine, through southern Russia, and finally into the Pannonian Basin of Hungary, is essentially 5,000 miles of uninterrupted horse food. The Mongol expansion wasn't just a military campaign. It was a journey along the world's longest natural highway, a highway that fed itself. Hungary, specifically, was the westernmost extension of this steppe corridor. The Great Hungarian Plain, called the Puszta, is a flat, open grassland that would have felt immediately familiar to any Mongol horse. It was, ecologically, almost identical to the environment the horses had grazed in their entire lives. When Subutai chose Hungary as the primary target of the 1241 campaign, he wasn't making a purely military decision. He was making a logistical one. The Great Hungarian Plain could sustain the Mongol herd. Western Europe, with its forests, its enclosed fields, its hedgerows and plowed furrows, could not. Where the grass ended, the Mongols stopped. This is not a poetic observation. It is a documented operational reality. But let's go deeper. Because the horses were only half the equation, the warriors themselves still needed to eat. And this is where the Mongol system becomes genuinely extraordinary. And, to medieval European eyes, genuinely horrifying. The primary field ration of a Mongol warrior on campaign was called boards. Historians who have reconstructed this process describe it in detail. Fresh meat, most commonly horse or beef, was cut into long, thin strips, then hung in the open air and dried in wind and sun until every trace of moisture was gone. The strips were then pounded or ground into a coarse powder. This powder was packed into sealed containers, often an animal's stomach or bladder, and carried on the horse. When a warrior needed to eat, he dissolved a small portion of the powder in hot water and had an instant, high-protein broth. The entire process, documented in sources including the Secret History of the Mongols, the travel accounts of Friar William of Rubruck, and later by Marco Polo, produced a ration that was extraordinarily calorie-dense, virtually weightless compared to its food value, and required no refrigeration because there was no moisture left to spoil. A single container of powdered boards could sustain a warrior for weeks or months. This was not accidental primitive food. This was engineered field nutrition, a solution developed across centuries of nomadic life on the steppe and perfected into a military advantage. Alongside boards, Mongol warriors carried krut, dried curd made from fermented milk, compressed into hard pellets and dried until they were almost stone-like. Krut lasted for years. It was so hard that accounts from the period describe foreign observers struggling to eat it, needing to soften the pellets in liquid before they became chewable. But each pellet was packed with fat, protein, and calories, and weighed almost nothing. A warrior could carry months of emergency calories in a small leather pouch hanging from his saddle. Combined with boards, a fully equipped Mongol rider entering Central Europe in 1241 was carrying, on his person and on his horses, a self-contained survival system that required no resupply, no cooking fire, and no logistical support from behind. He was, in the most literal sense, a human-powered autonomous unit. There was also arag, fermented mare's milk, slightly alcoholic, sour, nutrient-rich, and produced continuously by the mares traveling with the army. The mares served double duty. They carried riders when needed, but their primary military function was dairy production. A nursing mare produces several liters of milk per day. Fermented into arag, that milk became a portable, calorie-rich drink that also provided hydration in areas where clean water was uncertain. This was not incidental. The Mongols deliberately maintained a high ratio of mares in their horse herds precisely because the milk supply was operationally critical. The army, in effect, carried its own living dairy system on the hoof. And then, in the most extreme circumstances, in the situations that became legend and that horrified every European account, there was blood. Marco Polo documented this directly, and the process was neither as dramatic nor as brutal as it sounds in the telling. A warrior would make a small incision in the neck vein of one of his horses, collect a controlled quantity of blood, and drink it. The horse, which had enough blood to sustain such a withdrawal without permanent harm, was then treated and the wound closed. A single horse could provide enough blood to sustain a warrior for a day without removing an animal from operational service. It was a last resort, but it was a calibrated, deliberate last resort. Not savagery, but system design. The combination of all these elements, borts, kurut, airag, blood, and the living grass highway of the Eurasian steppe, meant that Batu Khan's army crossed the Carpathian Mountains in the winter of 1240 to 1241, carrying its own food supply on its body, supported by an ecological corridor that fed its horses, and arrived on the Hungarian plain in spring not weakened by the journey, but ready to fight. This is what European commanders in 1241 could not understand. They were thinking in terms of supply chains and baggage trains. The Mongols had eliminated the supply chain entirely. But even this extraordinary system had a vulnerability. And understanding that vulnerability explains not just how the Mongols conquered, but why they stopped. Go back to the horses. 5 horses per warrior. The horses need grass. The amount of grass required to sustain an army of this size is staggering. The logistical calculations suggest that a force of 40,000 warriors with 5 horses each was moving approximately 200,000 horses across the landscape. Each horse consumes roughly 10 kilograms of grass per day. 200,000 horses needed 2 million kilograms of grass every single day just to survive. Never mind to perform at military standards. This is why Mongol scouts, riding weeks ahead of the main army, were not primarily looking for enemy positions. They were mapping grass. They were assessing which valleys had the best pasture, which rivers had reliable water, and which routes would sustain the herd without stripping the land bare. One account from Roger of Torre Maggiore, an Italian cleric who was captured by the Mongols during the Hungarian campaign, and later wrote one of the most detailed surviving European accounts of the invasion, describes how the Mongols deliberately pulled back from the Hungarian border in late 1240 and waited, retreating 4 to 5 days' march away, leaving the borderlands untouched specifically so that the grass would recover before their advance. They were managing the pasture. They were farming the landscape with military precision. This worked brilliantly across the open steppe. It worked in Hungary because the Puszta, the great Hungarian plain around the Tisza and Danube rivers, was functionally steppe. But it failed, catastrophically and permanently, the moment the terrain changed. West of Hungary, the landscape transforms. The forests of Austria, the Rhine Valley, the Alps, the dense agricultural patchwork of France and the Holy Roman Empire. These environments had no steppe corridor. The grass disappeared. And where the grass disappeared, the horses disappeared. And where the horses disappeared, everything the Mongols were disappeared with them. Their speed, their mobility, their ability to coordinate armies across 500 kilometers, their capacity to fight and move simultaneously, all of it was built on the horse, and the horse was built on grass. This is the reason the Mongols never reached Paris or Venice or London. Not because Europe's armies stopped them, because Europe's ecology did. The winter of 1241 to 1242 made this limitation catastrophically clear. Scientific studies published in recent decades, including paleoclimatic research published in scientific reports and drawing on tree ring data, have shown that after the warm, dry summers that had sustained the Mongol advance from 1238 to 1241, early 1242 brought cold, wet conditions to the Hungarian plain. The Puszta, normally firm open grassland, became marshy and waterlogged. Pasture quality collapsed. The horses began to suffer. The army that had seemed unstoppable suddenly found itself struggling to feed the very biological engine that made it mobile. And then, in December 1241, word arrived that the great Khan Ogedei had died in Karakorum. Batu Khan and Subutai were required to return east for the succession. The combination of the logistical stress and the political imperative made the decision clear. The Mongols withdrew from Hungary in 1242, and they never returned to Central Europe in force. The system that had conquered half the world had run to the edge of the ecological zone that sustained it, and stopped exactly there. What remains, looking back across 8 centuries, is something that resists easy categorization. This was not an army in the way that European strategists understood armies. It was a mobile ecosystem, a self-feeding, self-sustaining biological machine built from the interaction of human beings, horses, grass, dried meat, fermented milk, and the vast Eurasian steppe. The Mongols did not solve the logistics problem by building better supply chains. They solved it by becoming their own supply chain. They carried their nutrition in their bodies, in their pouches, in their animals. They ate the landscape as they moved through it. They left the land behind them depleted and the land ahead of them untouched, managing their corridor of grass the way a modern army manages its fuel depots. Every great historical mystery has an operational answer. The Mongol conquest of 1241, 2 kingdoms crushed in 2 days across 500 kilometers of hostile terrain, was not a miracle of ferocity. It was the execution of a logistical system so completely integrated into the biology of the people who built it that it had no weak point for European armies to attack, no supply train to cut, no depot to destroy, no slow-moving wagon convoy to intercept and burn. The Mongols were the supply chain. You cannot cut what is inside the soldier himself. History remembers the battles. It remembers Legnica and Mohi and the terror that swept through the courts of Europe when word arrived that 2 armies had been destroyed within 24 hours of each other. It remembers King Bela IV fleeing across Croatia with Mongol riders in pursuit. It remembers the letters that the King of France sent to his mother, saying he feared the world was ending. It does not remember the dried powdered meat in the leather pouches. It does not remember the mares trotting behind the cavalry lines, producing milk that would be fermented into the drink that kept the warriors going. It does not remember the scouts riding weeks ahead of the invasion, not to spot enemy soldiers, but to map the grass. Those invisible things, the pouches, the mares, the grass, were the real reason Europe trembled in 1241. Civilizations are not destroyed by the weapons pointed at them. They are destroyed by the systems that sustain those weapons, running perfectly, invisibly, all the way from the steppe of Mongolia to the banks of the Sajo River on the morning of April 10th, 1241, when the sun rose over Hungary, and a world that had never seen anything like this found out what happens when you build an army that carries itself.